All right, let's dive in. When you really look at it, the natural world is all about connection. It's like a giant web with everything intertwined, even when it seems pretty unlikely.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, look at this picture we've got here. A moray eel with its mouth wide open and this tiny cleaner wrasse swimming right in. You'd think danger, right? But no, it's this delicate dance where the wrasse gets a meal and the eel gets a cleaning.
A perfect little community in action.
And that's what we're going to unpack today, those fascinating communities, all those different species interacting in all sorts of ways. We're using this chapter, Community Ecology, as our guide.
Our goal is to really get into the details. We'll cover the big theories, the essential concepts, and even some really interesting research findings. We're not going to skip anything. We'll make sure we hit all the important points, leaving no stone unturned.
So are you ready to explore this amazing world of ecological communities?
I am, and I think a great starting point is to consider the factors that influence how these communities are structured.
Okay, good point. Where should we start?
Well, the chapter highlights three major categories: foundation species, disturbances, and the interactions between species.
All right, let's break those down one by one. First up, foundation species sounds important. What exactly are they?
They're kind of like the backbone of a community. They have a huge impact because they're either super abundant or physically really large.
Okay, I'm with you.
And because of that, they provide habitat or food for tons of other organisms. The classic example is a coral reef. The corals themselves are the foundation species.
Ah, I see, like that picture, right. The parrotfish are depending on that coral reef.
Exactly. Figure 54.1. They get both their food and their shelter from the coral. And without the coral, the whole ecosystem would crumble. So that's why they're called foundation species.
So losing a foundation species would be like, what, pulling a Jenga block out of the bottom of the tower?
Pretty much, it could have a domino effect on the entire community, making them crucial for conservation efforts.
It's tough heavy.
Then we have disturbances.
Those sound a bit more dramatic.
Yeah, they can be. Disturbances are events that kind of shake things up in a community. They can remove organisms directly, like a storm wiping out a forest.
Right.
Or they can change how resources are available, things like light, nutrients, or space. That can have a huge impact on who can survive in a particular spot.
Okay, so it's not just the initial damage, but how things change afterwards that matters.
Precisely. And disturbances can be natural, like storms, fires, floods, or even droughts. But human activities also cause huge disturbances.
Of course, things like pollution and habitat destruction, those are disturbances too.
Exactly. And understanding how communities respond to these disturbances is really crucial.
So after a fire, do you see a whole different set of species moving in?
You might. Sometimes those disturbances create opportunities for new species, while others might struggle to recover. We'll talk more about that later when we get to ecological succession.
Okay, so the community can go through some big changes after a disturbance. Got it. And the last factor we've got here is interactions between species. That sounds like the real nitty-gritty of how communities function.
Yeah, it's the heart of community ecology. These interactions can have major effects on which species can live together, how many individuals there are, and even how they evolve over time.
Okay, so what are the main types of interactions we're looking at here?
The chapter breaks them down into three main categories: competition, exploitation, and positive interactions.
All right, competition sounds like a tough one. Is that when species are battling it out for resources?
It is. It's when two or more species need the same limited resources to survive. The textbook gives the symbol for this interaction, meaning it negatively impacts both organisms. Think of it like a tug of war. The harder one pulls, the harder it is for the other.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what kind of things do they compete over?
Basically, anything that's essential for survival and reproduction. Could be food, water, space, nesting sites, light, even pollinators. Anything that's in limited supply can be a source of competition.
Okay, so weeds competing with your garden plants for water and nutrients.
Exactly. That's a great example. Or lynx and foxes competing for snowshoe hares. The more hares one species eats, the fewer there are left for the other. This has a direct impact on their populations and can influence where we find them.
So this competition is playing out everywhere all the time, shaping the community.
All the time. And it's not always as straightforward as one species winning and the other losing. Sometimes they find ways to coexist, but we'll talk about that in a bit.
Got it. Now, the chapter mentions G.F. Goss's experiments with paramecium. What did those show about competition in a more controlled setting?
Goss was a pioneer in this field. He wanted to see what happened when two closely related species had to compete for the same resources.
Okay, so what did he do?
He grew two species of Paramecium aurelia and caudatum, both separately and together. When they were alone, each population did great. They grew and stabilized at a certain level.
All right, makes sense. But what happened when they were together?
That's where things got interesting. When they were in the same container with a limited food supply, P. caudatum couldn't keep up. It eventually went extinct.
Oh, wow. So one species completely outcompeted the other.
Exactly. And that led to the principle of competitive exclusion. Two species that are competing for the exact same resources can't coexist in the same place forever. Eventually, one will be slightly better at getting those resources and will drive the other one out.
So if they have the same needs, it's a recipe for disaster for one of them.
You could say that. Now, this principle has a really important implication. When we see two similar species thriving in the same area in nature, it tells us they must be doing something to avoid direct competition. They've found a way to specialize.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not always a fight to the death.
Right. And that brings us to the idea of an ecological niche.
Okay, break that down for me. What exactly is a niche?
It's basically the role a species plays in its environment. It's all about how it uses the resources around it, both the living things and the non-living things. Think of it like a species profession.
So like a woodpecker's niche is to find insects in trees, while a deer's niche is to graze on grass.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Now, if two species have the exact same niche, the competitive exclusion principle says they can't coexist in the long term. They'll be competing for the same things in the same way, and one will eventually lose out.
Okay, so competition plays a big role in how species fit together in a community.
It does. Now, we see lots of different species living together in nature, so how do they manage to avoid this cutthroat competition?
Yeah, how do they all get along?
Well, one important mechanism is resource partitioning.
Okay, what's that? Does it mean they're literally dividing up the resources?
Sort of. It means they evolve to use different resources or use the same resources in different ways, so they're not directly competing as much.
So like different birds feeding on different parts of the same tree.
Exactly. A great example is shown in figure 54.2. You've got these different species of anolis lizards in the Dominican Republic. They all eat insects, but they've evolved to use different perches. Some hang out on sunny fence posts, others on shady branches, and so on.
Ah, so by specializing, they can all find their own little slice of the insect pie.
Exactly. And there's temporal partitioning, too. Species might be active at different times of day or year, like figure 54.4 with those spiny mice. One is nocturnal, the other is diurnal, so they're not bumping into each other at the dinner table, so to speak.
So by dividing up resources in space and time, they can all make a living.
Precisely. And that specialization is one of the main drivers of biodiversity.
Right.
It allows more species to pack into the same area.
That's amazing. It's like nature's way of optimizing resource use. Now, the chapter also talks about fundamental versus realized niche. It uses Connell's barnacle experiment as an example. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. A species' fundamental niche is basically all the places it could potentially live and all the things it could potentially do if there were no competition or other limitations.
Okay.
But in the real world, there are always limitations. There's competition, there are predators, there are diseases. All these factors restrict a species to a smaller niche, which is called its realized niche.
So the realized niche is where they actually end up living, taking all those constraints into account.
You got it. Now, Connell's experiment with barnacles showed this really clearly. He was studying two species of barnacles, Pteromelus and Balanus, on the Scottish coast.
What did he find?
He found that Pteromelus could actually survive in the lower intertidal zone when Balanus wasn't around.
Oh, interesting. So it was capable of living in a wider range of conditions.
Right. But when Balanus was present, it outcompeted Cathamelus in the lower zone, pushing it up to the higher, drier zone.
So Balanus was the bully, essentially, limiting Cathamelus's realized niche.
Exactly. And this shows us that competition can really determine where we find species in nature. A species might be capable of living in a broader range of habitats, but interactions with other species can restrict them to a smaller area.
That's fascinating. Now, the chapter also mentions character displacement. What's that all about?
Character displacement is basically an evolutionary response to competition. It's what happens when two closely related species live in the same geographic area and compete for resources.
So they're constantly bumping heads.
Yeah, pretty much. Now, over time, natural selection will favor individuals in each species that have traits that allow them to use slightly different resources.
So they're evolving to reduce that competition.
Exactly. And the result is that these two species become more different from each other where they overlap compared to where they live separately.
So it's like competition is driving them to become more specialized.
Right. A classic example is seen in Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. Figure 54.5 shows two species, Geospiza fuliginosa and Geospiza fortis. On islands where they live together, their beak sizes are quite different, allowing them to specialize on different size seeds.
Makes sense.
But on islands where they live alone, their beak sizes are more similar, so competition has literally sculpted their evolution, pushing them to become more distinct where they coexist.
It's amazing. It shows how powerful these ecological interactions can be over evolutionary time. Okay, let's move on to the second category of interactions. Exploitation.
Sounds a bit more intense.
It does, doesn't it? This category includes predation, herbivory, and parasitism. So we're talking about one species benefiting at the expense of another, right?
You got it. Exploitation is a plus interaction, meaning one organism benefits and the other is harmed. Predation is the most obvious example. One animal, the predator, kills and eats another animal, the prey.
Lions hunting zebras, wolves chasing elk, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But it's not just big, dramatic chases. Think about a spider catching a fly in its web, or a tiny protist engulfing a bacterium. Predation happens at all scales.
Okay, so predation is a pretty straightforward concept. But what are the larger ecological effects of this constant hunt?
Well, it's more than just about one animal eating another. It's a powerful force that shapes the entire community. Predators can influence prey populations, keeping them in check and preventing any one species from becoming too dominant.
So they're helping to maintain biodiversity by preventing one species from taking over.
Exactly. And because of this constant pressure, both predators and prey have evolved all sorts of amazing adaptations. Predators have developed sharp senses, speed, agility, and weapons like claws, teeth, and venom.
Of course.
Yep.
They need those tools to be successful hunters.
Right. And prey have evolved ways to avoid becoming dinner. They might have camouflage, like those canyon tree frogs in figure 54.6, that blend in perfectly with their surroundings.
So they're playing hide and seek.
Yeah, basically. Others might have defensive structures, like thorns or armor, or they might be poisonous or taste bad.
Like those brightly colored poison dart frogs.
Exactly. A posematic coloration, figure 54.6. It's a warning to predators, hey, I'm toxic, don't even bother.
So it's a benefit to both, right?
Yeah,
The predator avoids a nasty meal, and the prey avoids being eaten.
precisely. And then we have mimicry, which is where things get really interesting.
Mimicry. That's where harmless animals pretend to be dangerous ones, right?
Yeah, you've got it. There's Batesian mimicry, where a harmless species evolves to resemble a dangerous one, like that hawk moth larva that looks like a venomous snake.
So they're essentially putting on a costume to scare off predators.
That's a great way to put it. And it works because predators have learned to avoid the real deal, so they avoid the mimic too. Then there's Mullerian mimicry, where two or more unpalatable species resemble each other.
So they're sharing the same warning signal.
Right. It reinforces the message to predators, stay away, we're all bad news. And the mimic octopus in figure 54.7 takes this to a whole other level. It can imitate the appearance and behavior of over a dozen other marine animals, both to avoid predators and to sneak up on prey.
That octopus is a true master of disguise.
It really is. Now, speaking of adaptation, the chapter has this really interesting scientific skills exercise about cane toads in Australia.
Oh, yeah, what was that about?
It's a great example of how quickly evolution can happen in response to a new threat. Cane toads were introduced to Australia and are highly toxic to native predators, like snakes. The exercise looks at how snakes in areas with cane toads have evolved greater resistance to the toxin.
So they're adapting to this new danger.
Exactly. Snakes from areas where toads have been around longer are less likely to eat toads, and even if they do, they're less affected by the toxin. This rapid evolution has implications for how ecosystems respond to invasive species.
It shows that evolution isn't just something that happens over millions of years. It can occur much faster than we might think.
Right, and that's something to keep in mind as we face more and more ecological changes.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to herbivory, the plant eaters. What's the ecological impact of all that munching?
Herbivory, like predation, is a plus interaction. The herbivore benefits by getting food, and the plant is harmed, although usually not killed outright.
Okay.
While we often think of large mammals as herbivores, the majority are actually insects.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, it's surprising. And in marine environments, you have things like sea urchins and manatees that play important roles as herbivores.
So what kind of impact does all this grazing have on plants and the rest of the community?
It can be pretty significant. Herbivores can control plant populations, influence which species are dominant, and even change the physical structure of a habitat. Just think about what happens when deer overgraze an area.
Right, they can completely change the landscape.
Exactly. Now, just like prey have evolved defenses against predators, plants have evolved ways to protect themselves from being eaten.
Thorns and spines are the obvious ones, but what else?
They also have chemical defenses. Some plants produce toxins that are poisonous or distasteful to herbivores, while others produce compounds that interfere with digestion or even insect development.
So it's a chemical arms race?
Pretty much. Plants evolve new defenses, and herbivores evolve ways to overcome them. And this back and forth plays out over evolutionary time, shaping the interactions between plants and the animals that eat them.
That's amazing. It's a constant battle for survival.
It is. Now let's talk about the last type of exploitation. Parasitism.
Ah, parasites. Those are the creatures that live on or in a host, harming it in the process.
Exactly. Parasitism is another plus interaction. The parasite benefits and the host suffers. Some parasites, like tapeworms, live inside their hosts. Those are endoparasites.
Okay.
Others, like ticks and lice, live on the outside. Those are ectoparasites. And then you have some really specialized parasites called parasitoids.
What are those?
They lay their eggs in or on a host, and their larvae then consume and kill the host. It's pretty gruesome, but it's a successful strategy for them.
Wow, nature can be brutal.
It can. Now, parasites can have complex life cycles, often involving multiple hosts, like that blood floop example in the chapter.
What about the effects of parasites? How do they impact their hosts and the wider community?
They can have a range of effects depending on the parasite and the host. They can weaken their hosts, making them more susceptible to disease or predation. They can reduce their reproductive success. And in some cases, they can even manipulate their host's behavior to benefit their own transmission.
So even though they're often small, parasites can have a big impact.
They can, and they're a reminder that ecological interactions can be incredibly complex and nuanced.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the third category of interactions. Positive interactions. These sound a bit more friendly.
They are. These are interactions where at least one species benefits and neither is harmed. We're talking about mutualism and commensalism.
So it's not always about competition and exploitation. Sometimes species cooperate.
Right, and these positive interactions can be just as important as the negative ones in shaping community structure. Let's start with mutualism.
Okay, tell me about it.
Mutualism is a plus-plus interaction, meaning both species benefit. It's like a win-win situation. And there are tons of examples in nature.
Like what?
Well, think about the bacteria that live in our guts and help us digest food.
Okay.
Or the bees that pollinate flowers, getting nectar in return. Or the mycorrhizal fungi that live in association with plant roots, helping them absorb nutrients.
Wow, those are all great examples. So mutualism is happening all around us.
It is, and it's often essential for the survival of both partners. The chapter has a really cool example of the relationship between acacia trees and ants.
Oh yeah, figure 54.9. Those ants are fierce defenders.
They are. The ants live in the thorns of the acacia tree, getting food and shelter. In return, they protect the tree from herbivores and even clear away competing plants.
So they're like the tree's personal bodyguards.
Exactly. And that kind of mutualistic relationship can have a big impact on the whole community. Now let's talk about commensalism.
Okay, what's the difference between mutualism and commensalism?
In commensalism, one species benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. It's a +0 interaction.
So it's like one species is getting a free ride without affecting the other.
Yeah, kind of. A good example is those cattle egrets that hang out with grazing herbivores. The egrets get to snack on the insects that the herbivores stir up, but the herbivores aren't really affected.
Interesting. So commensalism can still play a role in shaping a community, even if it's not as dramatic as mutualism or exploitation.
Right. And the chapter even points out that sometimes commensal relationships can evolve into mutualistic ones over time.
How does that happen?
Well, if the species that wasn't originally benefiting starts to get something out of the relationship, it becomes mutualism. For instance, if those egrets start eating ticks off the herbivores, then both species are benefiting.
Okay, I see. It's like the relationship upgrades from a one-way street to a two-way street.
Precisely. Now, speaking of positive interactions, the chapter mentions a cool example of how black rush benefits other plant species in New England salt marshes.
Oh, tell me about that.
So this black rush can tolerate the harsh conditions of the salt marsh, the high salt levels and the fluctuating water levels.
Okay.
And it turns out that its presence actually makes the environment more hospitable for other plants. It shades the soil, reducing evaporation and lowering the salt concentration. It also increases oxygen levels in the soil.
So it's modifying the environment in a way that benefits other species.
Exactly. When researchers removed the black rush, the number of other plant species that could survive in those areas dropped significantly. So the black rush is having a positive, indirect effect on the overall plant diversity of the marsh.
It's amazing how one species can have such a ripple effect through the community.
It really is. And it highlights how interconnected all these species are.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered the main types of interactions between species. Now, let's shift gears and talk about species diversity. What exactly does that mean and why is it so important?
Species diversity is basically a measure of the variety of life in a particular area. It has two key components: species richness and relative abundance.
Okay, break those down for me.
Species richness is simply the number of different species present, like how many different kinds of trees are there in a forest, or how many different types of fish are there in a lake.
Got it. So more species means higher richness. What about relative abundance?
Relative abundance is how common each species is compared to the total number of individuals. So, in a forest with 100 trees, if 50 of them are oak trees, then the relative abundance of oak trees is 50%.
Okay, so it's not just about how many different species there are, but also how evenly distributed they are.
Exactly. And a community with both high richness and high evenness is considered to be more diverse than one that's dominated by just a few species.
Why does that matter? Why is diversity a good thing?
Well, for a number of reasons. Diverse communities tend to be more stable, more resilient to disturbances, and more productive.
Okay, I can see why that would be important.
Yeah, it's like having a diversified investment portfolio. You're spreading out your risk.
Oh.
And the chapter highlights some really cool experiments that were done at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve.
Oh, what did those show?
They showed that plots with higher plant diversity were more productive overall. They produced more biomass. They were also better able to withstand droughts and recover from them more quickly.
So diversity seems to be a good insurance policy for an ecosystem.
That's a good way to put it. Now, measuring diversity isn't always easy, especially when you're dealing with small or hard-to-identify organisms like microbes.
Right, those guys are tiny. How do you even count them?
Well, traditionally, ecologists have relied on things like careful observation and sampling. But in recent years, there have been some amazing advances in molecular techniques.
Like DNA barcoding.
Exactly. DNA barcoding allows us to identify species from just a small snippet of DNA. And for microbes, we can use techniques like metagenomics to analyze the entire genetic makeup of a community.
So we're getting a much clearer picture of just how diverse life really is, especially at the microscopic level.
Absolutely. And these tools are revolutionizing our understanding of biodiversity and how it impacts ecosystem function.
Okay, so we've covered diversity. Now let's talk about trophic structure, the feeding relationships within a community. It's all about who eats whom, right?
Exactly. Trophic structure describes the flow of energy through an ecosystem.
Okay, explain that.
It all starts with the primary producers, the plants, algae, and some bacteria that can capture energy from sunlight or chemicals and convert it into organic matter.
So they're the base of the food chain.
Right. Then you have the herbivores, the primary consumers that eat the producers.
Okay.
And then you have the carnivores, the secondary consumers that eat the herbivores.
So it's like a chain reaction of eating and being eaten.
It is. And these chains can get quite long, with tertiary consumers eating secondary consumers and so on.
But in reality, it's not just a simple chain, is it?
No, it's much more complex than that. Food chains are interconnected to form food webs.
Food webs, those diagrams with all the arrows pointing in different directions.
Those are the ones. And in a food web, a species can occupy multiple trophic levels. Like a fox might eat berries, making it a primary consumer, but it might also eat rabbits, making it a secondary consumer.
So it's a tangled web of interactions.
It is, and understanding these food webs can be pretty challenging.
How do ecologists even begin to study them? They can be so complex.
Well, sometimes they simplify them by grouping species into functional groups. Like, instead of listing every single species of phytoplankton, they might just lump them all together as primary producers.
Okay, that makes sense.
Or they might focus on a particular part of the food web that's relatively self-contained.
So they're breaking down the complexity into more manageable chunks.
Exactly. Now, one interesting thing about food chains is that they tend to be pretty short. Usually there are only a few links.
Why is that? You'd think there could be more levels of consumers.
Well, there are a couple of explanations. One is the energetic hypothesis.
Okay, what's that?
Basically, it says that energy is lost as you move up the food chain. Only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level is transferred to the next.
So there's less and less energy available to support higher level consumers.
Right. That's why you don't see a lot of top predators. There just isn't enough energy at the top of the food chain to support large populations of them.
That makes sense. And the chapter mentions an experiment that supports this hypothesis.
Yeah, they manipulated the amount of leaf litter falling into artificial tree holes, simulating different levels of energy input at the base of the food chain. And they found that the holes with more leaf litter, meaning more energy, supported longer food chains.
So it's like a bottom-up effect. More energy at the bottom means more levels of consumers can be supported.
Exactly. Now, the chapter also talks about some special species that have a particularly big impact on community structure.
Like those foundation species we talked about earlier.
Right. Those are important, but there are also keystone species and ecosystem engineers.
Okay, what are those?
Keystone species are species that have a disproportionately large impact on their community relative to their abundance. They might not be the most numerous, but they play a crucial role.
So even though there aren't many of them, they have a big influence.
Exactly. The classic example is the sea star Pisaster ochraceus. It lives in the intertidal zone and preys on mussel.
What's so special about that?
Well, without the sea star, mussels would outcompete other species for space, and you'd end up with a much less diverse community.
So the sea star is keeping the mussels in check, allowing other species to thrive.
Precisely. And when researchers removed the sea star, the diversity plummeted. The mussels took over, and many other species disappeared.
Wow, that's a dramatic example of how important a single species can be.
It is. And it highlights the interconnectedness of these communities. Removing one seemingly insignificant species can have cascading effects.
Okay, what about ecosystem engineers?
Ecosystem engineers are species that physically modify their environment, creating or altering habitats for themselves and other species.
Like what?
Beavers are a great example. By building dams, they transform flowing streams into ponds, creating wetlands that support a whole different set of species.
So they're literally reshaping the landscape.
They are, and those changes can have ripple effects throughout the ecosystem. Some species benefit from the new habitat, while others might be negatively impacted.
It's like they're the architects of their environment.
Exactly. Now, the chapter also discusses bottom-up and top-down controls on community structure.
Okay, what's the difference between those?
Bottom-up control means that the structure of the community is determined by the resources available at the bottom of the food chain, like nutrients and sunlight. So the amount of plant biomass will limit the number of herbivores, which in turn will limit the number of carnivores.
So it's like a pyramid. The base determines how big the top can be.
Right. Top-down control, on the other hand, means that the top predators are controlling the structure of the community.
How does that work?
Well, if you have a lot of predators, they'll keep herbivore populations in check, which will allow plants to thrive. So the top predator is having a cascading effect down through the food web.
Okay, so it's like a chain reaction in reverse.
Exactly. Now, understanding whether a community is primarily controlled from the bottom up or the top down is important for conservation and management.
How so?
Well, if you're trying to restore a degraded ecosystem, you need to know what's driving the changes. Is it a lack of resources, or is it a problem with the predator-prey balance?
I see. You need to address the root of the problem.
Precisely. And the chapter gives an example of using top-down control to manage algal blooms in lakes.
How does that work?
In some lakes, algal blooms are a problem because there are too many nutrients, leading to excessive algal growth.
Okay.
But in other cases, it's because there aren't enough zooplankton, the tiny animals that graze on algae.
So the algae are growing out of control because there's nothing to eat them.
Right. And that can happen because there are too many fish that eat the zooplankton. So by removing some of those fish, you can allow the zooplankton populations to recover, which in turn will control the algal blooms.
So you're manipulating the food web to achieve a desired outcome.
Exactly. And that's a powerful tool for managing ecosystems.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's shift gears again and talk about how disturbance influences communities.
Sounds good.
The chapter introduces the non-equilibrium model, which suggests that communities are constantly changing due to disturbances.
Right. It's a shift away from the old idea of a balance of nature, where communities reach a stable equilibrium and stay that way.
So it's more about constant change and adaptation.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And disturbances can be anything from fires and floods to human activities like logging and pollution.
Okay. And the chapter introduces the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. What's that about?
This hypothesis suggests that moderate levels of disturbance can actually promote greater species diversity.
Well, that's counterintuitive. Why would that be?
Well, if there are too many disturbances, only a few species that are really good at colonizing and recovering quickly will be able to survive.
Okay, I see.
But if there are very few disturbances, a few dominant species might outcompete everyone else, leading to lower diversity.
So it's like the Goldilocks principle. You need just the right amount of disturbance.
Exactly. And that intermediate level of disturbance creates a mosaic of habitats at different stages of recovery, which allows for a greater variety of